Armoura's Crown. A short horror story. Written by Michael Vandervoort. Narrated by Robin Reads. I remember it was toward the end of a bitterly cold autumnal day that I first questioned the great detective Erasmus Crane about these matters. We had been sitting in his study for the better part of an hour, him poring as usual over some strange tome in a half-forgotten language, whilst I pursued some lighter reading by way of the Times, or some such paper of the day. Having tired of the news and seeing that Crane was himself weary of his work, I suggested that we take tea, and, after completing one or two notes in the margin of the book, the great detective acquiesced to my suggestion and pulled up a chair by the fire opposite to my own. Perhaps it was the overwhelming gloom of the evening, the melancholy pang that comes always toward the end of the year, or the fact that the question had been circling in mind for weeks, like a dog looking for the perfect place to dig, but I decided all at once that I would pluck up the courage and ask my dear friend the question that had been gnawing at me for many months. "How is it," I asked cautiously, "that a self-professed man of science, who showed such skepticism in his younger years, came to be not only an expert on matters of the supernatural and the occult, but also a firm believer?" Whilst the experiences we had shared over the past year had convinced me beyond any doubt that such things did exist, lurking in the shadowy places beyond the edges of our general understanding, it had struck me as odd, even then, that Crane, who had written extensively to challenge such superstitious beliefs and dismiss them as nonsense, was willing to believe. Whereas I might have struggled at first glance to accept the supernatural elements of these cases, he was not only happy to accept them, but was clearly wary and indeed fearful of them. Something, then, I reasoned, must have occurred in his past, some incident or occasion that switched him from his position as an avowed skeptic to a firm believer. The answer he gave to me that evening was as frank and straightforward as it was chilling. A month after Crane first shared these details with me, I asked his permission to record them. The incident the story refers to is one that I remember reading about at the time, but which was obviously presented in a very different way by the press. What follows is that story, shared with his express permission, in Crane's own words, and as he relayed it to me that night. "The answer to your question, my friend," he said with a wry, knowing smile, "was the incident with Armoura's crown. Up to that point, I had never granted any credence to those supposed occurrences deemed by the weak-minded as supernatural. I had no truck with fanciful tales of ghosts, demons, and vampires, and judged those who believed in such things to be either stupid, deluded, or both. I must say that it was with a mix of both interest and incredulity that I first read of Ms. Armoura's proposed event in the Gentleman's Magazine, but not because I believed her powers to be genuine. In fact, it was precisely the opposite reason. Whilst I had always been dismissive of the supernatural in general, I reserved a special measure of disdain for the practitioners of such arts as divination, the reading of fortunes, and the alleged verbal communication with those who have departed this plane. To me, these people were little better than the strand wolves and vultures that feed on carrion. Pretenders and opportunists, they exploit their grieving marks when they are at their most vulnerable. It is to me a practice both avaricious and abhorrent. It is also one that, for a time, I took great pleasure in exposing. Many is the time that I have watched some charlatan on stage, cloaked in black and attempting by means of some clever contrivance to convince his paying audience that he is communicating with the dead. I have seen such spectacles both from my seat in a theatre and up close in settings no larger than a drawing-room. On every occasion, I have taken great pleasure in silently unpicking and deconstructing the methods by which the deception was achieved. On several occasions, Unable to bear the arrogance and pomposity of the fraud, I publicly exposed the trickster by quietly noting for everyone to hear how the trick was done. On one occasion, I took great pleasure in separating, by means of a pair of pliers I had concealed in my garments, the invisible line of thread used by the medium to twitch and move the curtain, an action she attributed to the intercession of spirits. Her supposed abilities in precognition clearly did not extend to recognition of my own intercession to derail her ridiculous charade. She didn't see that coming. How I struggled to stifle a laugh when the moment came for the trick to commence, only for the severed string to instead simply lie there, limp, immobile, and useless, dead as those with whom she claimed to speak. I observed with some glee as she, with her eyes fixed facing forward, referred to the trick she had scheduled, saying aloud, "See how the curtains are drawn back and forth. See this symbol of the veil of death retreating." I watched as each of the assembled looked first at the curtain that had not moved an inch, then back at the medium as she pulled unseen again and again with her foot attached to the string in an attempt to make it move. "See," she repeated, her voice beginning to crack in panic. "See how—" She turned to look, and, finding the curtain stationary, returned to her wailing and moaning act, whilst the gathered bereaved mumbled amongst themselves, clearly unimpressed. On another occasion, I attended a séance during which the medium supposedly spoke with any number of spirits. I confess that, on that evening, the atmosphere created was somewhat convincing. The lights were lowered to pitch darkness, and long pauses of pregnant silence, sometimes up to 2 minutes, were left between each utterance from the medium. I remember sitting there quietly in the dark, the only sound the gentle sea surf hiss of breath, and realizing just how unnerving the experience would be for one who happened to believe. For, in only a few seconds, seated in the darkness with no way to see what might be creeping slowly from the space behind you, the basest of instincts slyly begin to stir. The longer that silence lasts, the more time spent in anticipation of what could and might be waiting behind you, the more likely are the hairs on the back of the neck to rise, as you feel, just in the subtle shifting of the air, some presence in there with you. We were told to join hands, to lift those hands off the table. This way everyone's hand was occupied and nobody could be knocking on the table themselves. The medium drew back her chair to demonstrate that she was not using her legs in any way, then called out to the spirit, demanding that it answer her calls by rapping on the table. Again the pause. An icy vista of silence that seemed to stretch away like the surface of a glacier out into the dark and endless distance. Then the knocking. Sure enough, the call was answered. Loud, heavy raps on the surface of the wood, unmistakably made by the blunt surface of a knuckle. It was, I am loath to admit, difficult at that moment not to imagine cold, greyed skin, split and cracked as it stretched dry, rotten and taut over the bones. Cold dead flesh withered and ravaged by the workings of time and fastidious labour of the worm, reaching up toward the table. The knocks from beyond answered questions, yes or no. It even indicated the letters of its name by rapping a specified number of times. I said nothing, allowing the spectacle to reach its climax and watching as the grieving families paid their donations and were bundled away, huddled in floods of tears. I pretended to have been convinced and returned the following month. You see, it had occurred to me how strange it was for such a heavy, circular table to have its 6 legs on the outside. I am, as you have probably guessed, no great connoisseur of furnishings, but even my basic understanding of joinery and physics suggested that such a table would have been better served with a single leg or support in the centre, which, of course, led me to wonder why this approach was not taken, and for what purpose that central area might have been made. As soon as the knocking ceased on my first visit, I decided to investigate. Whilst maintaining a fixed and steadfast expression, I was at work beneath the table. Concealed from view, I allowed the toe of my boot to search carefully the area below where any central strut might have been, and, sure enough, found what I was looking for. A brass ring, nailed to the floor, and the subtly protruding edges raised ever so slightly above the naked floorboards. A trapdoor, through which, I imagined, a person concealed below the boards could raise an arm undetected beneath the table and knock upon the underside when summoned. Moving my foot a little more, I found the second clue, a small but definitely noticeable hinge. The trapdoor could be opened from below. The brass ring was a failsafe, one that I chose to exploit. On my next visit, I made sure during one of the long pauses to slip my walking cane below the table and, by slow, careful movements, to slide it through the ring and across the extent of the trapdoor. When the time came for the knocking to begin, there was certainly a commotion from below, but no knocking, as the accomplice was unable to open the trapdoor from below, and so also unable to reach up to knock on the underside of the table. The pièce de résistance came when I used another pause to lower the glass of red wine I had been served under my chair, and deliberately kick it so that it would fall and leak through the cracks at the edge of the trapdoor. When the medium's assistant came into the room later with his shirt badly stained, I knew the game was up and exposed the entire show. This was just as I planned to do with the famous Ms. Armoura. The scheduled spectacle was to involve the supposed psychic performing a reading with an article of genuine historical significance, namely, the thorny crown of Thurun the Terrible. This artifact, a true relic from a time of barbarism and savagery, was fashioned in mockery of the crown worn by the Saviour, and belonged to that fabled Romanian king, Helmut Thurun. The crown, a complex adornment ceremonially worn by Thurun at banquets each evening, resembled the thorned crown, in that it was made up of the intricate weaving of sharp needle-like protrusions that jutted outward from the crown's central ring at irregular angles, like a laurel wreath, like the branches of a hawthorn bush, or indeed a hastily twisted crown of thorns. In this particular case, however, the horror instilled by the item was increased not only by the circumstance afforded to it, but by the very nature of the materials used in its composition. For rather than wood, metal, or thorns, this crown, refashioned each evening around a solid central loop of iron, was decorated not with thorns, but with the lately removed fingers of Thurun's enemies. Primarily, these would be the fingers of archers captured from the opposing side, and who, in order to render them unable to loose a bow ever again, were mutilated through the removal of their fingers. Initially, when worn each evening during times of war, the digits, freshly removed, would still be leaking blood, plump and swollen with bruising and trauma. Paintings, said to reconstruct the event as it would have been, show a triumphant Thurun raising a goblet, adorned with this hideous mantle. In them it is clear to see long streaks of rust brown and red staining his face and neck, whilst dripping rivulets of liquid crimson fell and trickled from above. In later years, when Thurun's kingdom was no longer at war, the digits were fixed in place, and, after a long period of decomposition, stripped clean of flesh so that the remaining bone could be more artfully woven into place. The resulting crown is an intricate lattice of interlocking finger bones, jutting out at curious angles, and is considered a gruesome treasure of the Middle Ages. It was scheduled for display at the British Museum later that month, alongside a number of other curiosities of the same period. To look at the crown, I must admit, occupied a strange space, in that it was at once a beautifully made and also a hideously ugly thing. The bones, with time, had turned a yellowish ivory colour, and retained upon their many overlapping surfaces a sheen, similar to what one sees on a well-worn piece of wood or stone polished smooth over centuries by consistent footfall or the touch of many hands. How and for what purpose Armoura was to be allowed within touching distance of the piece was a mystery, save for the possibility that the publicity generated by her attempt to contact those to whom the removed digits belonged was good for the exhibition. The crown's historical significance notwithstanding, the mere thought of an event in which Armoura would be given license to manhandle an article of genuine archaeological merit and use it as a prop in a cheap conjuring trick put me in an ill humour. It was, to put it bluntly, an outrage and an affront to any serious, rational-minded person that these parlour games and deceptions should be allowed to be staged alongside exhibits of a more serious nature. The danger, of course, being that by blurring the lines between the two, an organization or individual might be seen to suggest that such tomfoolery actually bore some merit, or had anything approaching respectability within the spheres of serious study. The advertised intention of the so-called spiritual reading was for the famed medium to contact those on the side opposing Thurin, and whose hands and fingers had been unceremoniously removed following their capture. The supposed logic behind such an exercise was that spirits, killed or wronged in some violent way, are widely accepted to be the most vocal, particularly when some item that they feel belongs to them has been left behind on earth. Who exactly Miss Armoura counted amongst the accepting individuals so as to consider this matter to have an acceptance that could ever be considered wide was another mystery to be added to the matter of how a contemporary Englishwoman was to be expected to converse with a 14th-century Romanian. This second query was neatly explained away with a caveat, that in the spirit realm all languages are mutually understood. I considered whether Miss Armoura might also understand the colourful and inventive language I would cast her way given half the chance. As soon as the event was announced, I resolved to make it my business to attend, and, if possible, to interrupt the proceedings in such a way as to expose Miss Armoura's nonsense for the claptrap it so clearly was. On the night itself, I was fully prepared to accept the scorn of the assembled believers in order to make it clear that the central tenets of their belief were built on sand, their prophets charlatans, and their beliefs amusing anachronisms as suited to a modern world of science and industry as was the gruesome bauble they had all gathered to see. In the event, however, I was chastened and halted in my intentions by a most curious and singular occurrence, the likes of which I have never before seen, and hope never to see again. As the lights in the small display hall were dimmed, so that only a single candelabra, strategically placed, illuminated the crown and the area directly behind it, a hush fell upon the group of onlookers. There were initially around 24 of us there that night. Hundreds had applied for permission to attend, and I was forced to call in a favour with an old friend at the museum to ensure my attendance. For a few moments, and in keeping with the atmospherics achieved at other séances I had attended, we were met with only silence. Nothing stirred. The attendees were seated in a tight horseshoe shape at the head of which a great black curtain had been draped to cut off this performance from the other exhibits. In the middle of this congregation the crown had been set up, so that in the hush we were allowed an unobstructed view and time to contemplate both the violence and cruelty that could bring such an artifact into being, and the fascination with such emotions that drove men of the present age to preserve and venerate them. I will concede that in those quiet moments, just as at the other meetings, one is lulled into an almost trance-like state of reflection, which no doubt contributes to the effect of the performance, especially when the silence is broken in the way it was that night. A bell, clarion-sharp and high-pitched, sliced through the silence with a single peal that made many visibly jump in their seats. Then, as the sounds seemed to ebb and slide away, seeping into the silence that closed around and enveloped it, there stepped from behind the curtain a pale and gaunt-looking apparition of a woman. The mere sight of this ghoul, done up in such a frightful and dramatic manner, was enough to give some of the more weak-minded a turn, and there was much scurrying amongst the gathered, as a number of women, judging themselves unable to remain for the duration of the show, were led to the exits by their attendant males, many of whom seemed equally glad of having been given an excuse to depart. Back on stage, the still and imperious Ms. Armoura waited patiently for silence. Armoura Herschel could not have been more than 35 years old, though dressed as she was from head to toe in a thick black smock and sporting a similarly black turban that gave her appearance of some jinn from illustrations of the Arabian Nights. She could have been of any age, and of any time. Even I, who had chosen to attend with no greater intention than to pour scorn upon the entire proceeding, had to admit that Armoura had in spades what is often termed stage presence. With her dark lipstick and wild, staring eyes made up with slashes of charcoal, she looked for all the world as if she had simply materialized from the darkness that encroached on every side around that lonely oasis of illumination. Bleeding from the black in inky swirls like something from an Aubrey Beardsley print. With arms outstretched, her fingers curled in a theatrical balletic posture of grasping or reaching, she began all at once to speak, announcing that we, the assembled audience, were privileged amongst men, as we would hear that very night voices from a bygone era that had not been heard by any man for many multiples of centuries. Staring blankly ahead as if addressing the furthest wall rather than those who gathered round her, she spoke in complex, jargon-filled sentences about Solomonic magic, the Abramelin, and scrolls of Enoch, none of which had any relation to this artifact, but to which reference was being clearly made to bolster her own credentials and to baffle and impress her audience. As Armoura stepped forward toward the crown, which was laid in ceremonial reverence upon a velvet cushion, and looking far more delicate and dainty than one might have imagined, I strained my eyes, trying to make them adjust to the darkness, to scan the corners and the edges of the room, and the curtain for some accomplice who could no doubt intone, with a miscellaneous European accent, the expected words for all to hear and wonder at. Where, I wondered, was the amplification? How best could the acoustics be exploited to create some interesting effect? I searched the hall, mostly shrouded in darkness, looking not only around the performance area, but to my fellow audience members. It was only by chance, and after a long period of close examination, that I noticed a single errant highlight protruding from the gap in one of the black drapes. The drapes, behind Armoura and through which she had come, had, once they were closed, an almost imperceptible split in the middle. As I moved and angled myself in my seat, a clearer view revealed to my searching eyes the tiniest glimmer of a reflective surface, an instrument of some kind clearly held by someone standing just behind that curtain. Raising myself up in my seat almost to the point that I was forced to stand and incur the muttered grumblings of those seated next to me, I again caught a glimpse of this highlight, this time with greater clarity. The object was undoubtedly the bell or flume of some brass instrument in the same family as the trumpet or trombone. This, I imagined, would be an instrument of Miss Armoura's own device that would amplify any sounds spoken into it, acting almost as the reverse of the ear trumpets employed by old men who have become deaf in their later years. This instrument, made to magnify voice by increasing the volume and no doubt distorting the sound, would be employed at a crucial moment to create the effect of a disembodied voice intruding upon proceedings. I was just about to actually rise from my seat in order to confirm my suspicions, when Armoura reached forward and placed her hands upon the finger crown. I stopped still. Something about the irreverence of it, the sheer audacity of this prankster and fraud using this genuine relic as little more than a stage prop made my blood boil. As I watched on, the supposed medium lifted the crown gently from its plinth and, with great care and circumstance, placed it gently onto her own head. The cry she let out in response will occupy a dark corner of my soul until my dying day. It was a cry like nothing I have ever heard before, high-pitched and yet somehow heavy, as if laden with some fleshy, tangible weight. It tore through the vocal apparatus in such a way that it seemed not to have been created by them, but ripped through them, as if the sound had been wrenched from the speaker before they had a chance to fully form it. Subsequent noises, another scream and a deep guttural curdling in the throat, seemed almost to confirm that the voice box and vocal cords had been destroyed, torn or shredded by the force of that initial eruption. As I watched in horror, Armoura's head snapped back with brutal, unrestrained force, in the manner that a pugilist's head might ricochet back from an upward blow. It was an ugly, elastic movement that seemed both damaging and unnatural, and yet, somehow, despite these convulsions, the crown remained where it was, fixed to the head as if it had been welded in place. As I was to find out, this was not so inaccurate an analogy to draw, for, as the assembled group looked on and Armoura, wailing in agony, sank to her knees, clouds, either of steam or smoke, began to rise from the crown, as the acrid stench of burnt hair filled the room. Pulling and wrenching at the crown, Armoura attempted to pull it off as the accomplice, still holding the sound device, emerged from behind the curtain and rushed toward her. Still on her knees, screaming wildly and clutching at the thing with such force that the sharper edges of the bone lacerated her hands, slicing them to ribbons, she suddenly snapped upward. Still kneeling, but straight-backed and switching her hands from the crown to her hair, she pulled in two swift motions the long steel needles she had used to pin and fix up her hair out from the curls. As the accomplice lunged in an attempt to stop her, and the assembled crowd screamed in terror, she took the ends of those cold steel cylinders, sharpened to a point on either end, and thrust them in a single jabbing motion into the holes of her ears. In the very moment, the very instant that this action took place, I pounced upon her writhing form and, taking the bottle I had prepared from my pocket, smashed it violently over her head, allowing the liquid to cover her, fracturing the crown in the process. The screaming stopped. Armoura sank, bleeding and sodden, into a fetal slump as I struggled around to check on her. A few months later, I went to check on Armoura. After a short spell at St. Philip's Hospital, during which the doctors confirmed that she had not only endured some form of hideous chemical burn, but had also pierced and ruptured her own eardrums with the points of the needles, she was moved, on the advice of consultants, to the Seward Sanatorium, where she remains to this day. When I last saw her, she was huddled in the corner of the room, rocking gently back and forth, muttering unintelligibly to herself. It was only after a few minutes that I began to realize what she was trying to say. It was the same phrase over and over. They all screamed at once. They all screamed at once. They all screamed at once. It was too much for her mind to take. At the conclusion of Crane's story, I was obviously left with a number of questions, chief amongst which was why he had chosen, instead of helping Armoura, to break a bottle over her head. His answer, though direct, brought up further questions. The bottle was a talisman. Inside was a crucifix made from strips of palm used on the feast day mass. This object floated in holy water, mixed with the Ash Wednesday ashes made from the burned palms of the previous year. I broke the bottle not to injure, but to save her. But, Crane, if this was the incident that made you a believer, and you had gone to the event with the intention of exposing it, then why would you, as a non-believer, carry such an object with you? Erasmus Crane smiled broadly. Because a skeptic's mind is still an open one. There is no such thing as scientific fact, my friend, only hypotheses and theories that have become accepted as such, because they have not thus far been disproven. Everything in our understanding is open for debate. I believe in preparing for every eventuality and being prepared, no matter how small the risk might appear. As our recent adventures have proven, I was right to be overly cautious. After all, it is the arrow you never see coming that will be the one to kill you." With that, he rose to his feet and, yawning loudly, crossed the room, settling into a position at the desk, preparing once again for a long night of intense and detailed study into the occult and the arcane, a process he considered to be necessary training if he was to arm himself fully for the battles that were still yet to come. This has been Armoura's Crown, a short horror story, written by Michael Vandervoort, narrated by Robin Reads. Copyright 2024 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.